such as these. Oh, I have taken too little care, too little care of this. Take physic, pomp, expose thyself to feel what wretches feel, that thou mayst shape the superflux to them and show the heavens more just.
These lines are from Shakespeare's King Lear, and they're Lear's famous soliloquy and prayer, his awakening in the storm. Now, Lear is a familiar story, but I'm going to tell it anyway, just to put us freshly in the middle of it. So we're in ancient Britain, and there's an old king named Lear, and he's getting ready to hand over his kingdom to his 3 daughters. So he summons them before him, and he says, whoever can make the greatest speech about how much she loves him will get the greatest portion of his land. Now, the 2 oldest daughters, Goneril and Regan, care more about the inheritance than they do about their father. So they make their big speeches and they get their land. But the youngest daughter, Cordelia, who's his favorite and who loves him more than the other 2 put together, has no speech to make. She says, I cannot heave my heart into my mouth. His pride is wounded, and he tells her, speak again. But again, she won't tell him what he wants to hear. So he not only revokes her inheritance, but he banishes her. Now, a good nobleman, the Earl of Kent, stands up and speaks up for Cordelia. And then Lear banishes him too. The one truth-teller whom Lear allows to stay is the fool. This is his court jester, and of course it's the jester's job to tell the king the truth in the form of riddle and jest and song. So even though he also tells Lear what a mistake he's made, he gets to stay, and he follows Lear faithfully throughout the rest of the play. So here we are on the heath. Picture this great moor, and we're in the midst of a hurricane. It's later in the play, and Goneril and Regan have now stripped Lear of everything he has. They've locked him out in the cold and rain, and he's deep in grief. His few remaining friends are taking shelter in a hovel nearby. And drenched in rain and wind, he's asking himself a question. What do poor people do in this weather? Now, Lear is an old man. He's lived through many, many storms, but he appears to be asking this question for the first time. And then he feels regret. Oh, I have taken too little care of this. Then he gives himself some advice. Take physic, pomp, expose thyself to feel what wretches feel, that thou mayst shake the superflux to them and show the heavens more just. Or to suck all the poetry out of it, share your stuff with the oppressed and dispense some cosmic justice. Here, in the outer reaches of suffering, Lear is having an awakening. For the past few years, I've been obsessed with a passage by the writer Frederick Buechner. I want to share it with you. There are religion books and religious books. A religion book is a book with religion in it and the everyday sense of religious ideas, symbols, attitudes, and, if it takes the form of fiction, with characters and settings that have overtly religious associations and implications. A religious book may not have any religion as such in it at all, but to read it is in some measure to experience firsthand what a religion book can only tell about. King Lear would be an example. The writer of a religious book tends to achieve most when he is least conscious of doing so. The attempt to be religious is as doomed as the attempt to be poetic is. Thus, in the writing, as in the reading, a religious book is an act of grace, no less rare, no less precious, no less improbable. These words haunt my writing life, and in a minute I'll tell you why. But first, I just want to push on Frederick Buechner a little bit. Why does he call King Lear religious work? It is horror upon horror. Almost all the honest people die. There's a lot of talk about the vagaries of fortune, but God appears to be entirely absent. And in fact, I think you could argue that when Lear challenges the rich and powerful to show the heavens more just, he's sort of implying that they're not doing a very good job with justice on their own. And yet, when Buechner saw this play, something happened to him. It wasn't just Lear, but Buechner who had an awakening. Now, Buechner says that as a writer, you cannot do this on purpose. And I think what he's getting at is the risk of trying too hard. You know, that if, like he says, the risk of the poet trying to sound poetic. If you try to be religious, maybe you're just going to get a bunch of annoying abstractions or spiritual jargon, or, you know, and even if you avoid that trap, well, so much of this depends on what the reader brings to the book. And there's things that are just out of the writer's control. And yet, I'm still obsessed with this passage because at my first workshop at Bennington, one of these famous writers that we study with told us that as writers, we should write the book that we had always wanted to read but never found. And what I want to read is Buechner's religious book. I want my life to be changed. Show me a glimpse of the ground of being and let me come out changed. Expand my sense of what's possible. I think I'm not so odd in this, right? And we all open books hoping for that deep connection, the big aha, the thing we were looking for but couldn't name. So here comes Buechner describing this book, and then he tells me in the next breath that I can't write it on purpose. So just supposed to wait for the spirit to alight on me, like a dove is probably too much to hope for because I'm from Long Island. Maybe a seagull. The mystic in me loves this idea and feels almost that it's intuitively true that our best work arrives as a gift. But the skeptic in me knows that there is much more to writing than that. Sure, maybe Shakespeare was not out to give his audience a spiritual experience, but I would bet that he was out to give them a moral experience, an emotional experience, an experience of human truth. And when you put all those things together, I think they're pretty close cousins to the spiritual. So maybe we can say that the religious book is something like a meditation room, or a house of worship, or a nature reserve, or Tishman Auditorium, in that it is a place designed to be hospitable to wondrous encounters, even if it can't guarantee them. So there's probably 1,000 ways to write this book. Many writers have tried it. But today we're going to stay pretty close to where we started on the Heath, and I'm going to talk about two writers who were very strongly influenced by King Lear in the way that they tried to write the religious book. One of them is Frederick Buechner himself, and his novel Godric was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize in 1981. The other writer is James Agee, and his nonfiction book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, started out as a magazine article and then blossomed into this strange, ambitious piece of literary journalism. Now, I noticed 5 things about how these books work, and I'm going to share them with you, but I have to give you a caveat. These are not meant to be prescriptive, because there's no formula, right, or it would be art. And also, one of the reasons I'm attracted to these books is they are not spotless successes. Like human beings, they are messes of beauty and failure. You could say that these two writers went on a holy fool's errand, and they tripped on their feet along the way. But here we go. Number 1, musical language. Although Godric is a novel, and Let Us Now Praise Famous Men is nonfiction, at times they both read like poetry. In the lectures last January, the poet Laura Haynes said that musical language can actually snake charm your left brain, and I love that idea, that language, when used musically, can kind of calm down the nitpicky part of your brain enough to experience a truth that you would otherwise miss. That sound puts us in a receptive state. Here's an example from Buechner's novel, Godric. This book is based on the life of a 12th century hermit named Godric, and the only account of the real life Godric that remains is hagiography. That means official religious biography. So it focuses on his, saintly deeds and miraculous healings and things like that. What Buechner does is he takes these bare details and he creates a whole story around them, which is much more dark and colorful and complicated. So Buechner's Godric may be a saint, but he's a very earthy and messed up saint. Now the frame for the book is that Godric is now 105 years old. And this irritatingly pious monk named Reginald comes from a nearby monastery and wants to record the details of his life. And he instructs Godric, quote, to unbushel the light of your days for the schooling of children, to set them a path to follow. So here's how that turns out. This is Godric speaking. I have told Mother Reginald tales to rattle his beads and blush his fish-bellied tonsure pink as a babe's bum. But he turns them all to treacle with his scratching quill. I scoop out the jakes of my remembrance, and he senses it all with his clerkish screed till it reeks of mass. He brings me broth and plover's eggs. He freshens my straw when I foul it. If some dream shipwrecks me at night, he's there with his taper to beacon me safe to shore. Just the sight of his sheep face gives me the cramp. So Beaconer is using a poet's tools here. He has assonance, alliteration. He has patterns of accentual rhythm. He brings me broth and plover's eggs. He's absorbed the music of Shakespeare, and he's using it to ferry us to a world where otherworldly things happen. When we look at James Agee, you're going to see the same cadences. 2, earthy sensory detail. Did you notice in that paragraph we just saw that all 5 of the senses were present? Let's look at this. There's the sight of the blushing monk, the rattle of the beads and the scratching quill. There's the smell of the incense of mass and the soiled straw. There's the taste of broth and plover's eggs, and there's the feel of a cramp. So we are very firmly grounded here in the physical world. This is equally true of King Lear, which is a play that could not unfold in the disembodied ether. Think of Lear getting drenched with the icy rain, or Edgar coming along disguising himself as Tom of Bedlam by rubbing mud all over his body. Now, why do this? Why use the senses? Well, one is to anchor us here on planet Earth so that we can kind of to earn our trust for the more otherworldly things that are going to come later. But another is to get us to imagine ourselves into the character's body, and this is what James Agee is up to, and let us now praise famous men. Let me tell you a little about that book. In 1936, Fortune magazine sent James Agee and the photographer Walker Evans down to rural Alabama to report on the lives of sharecroppers, tenant farmers. These, of course, were people who were barely getting by working other people's land. They shared almost every aspect of their lives for 4 weeks. They shared their meals. They harvested cotton alongside them. They saw how the children were treated at school and how the family was treated in business dealings. And what they produced was not published. It was 400 pages of obsessively detailed documentary reporting, flooded with meditations on art and education and human actuality. What happened to them? Agee went down there and had an awakening that wouldn't stop. He was walking around with a vision of the holy radiating out of everything that he saw, and he couldn't shut it off. His book recreates that experience. And even so, Agee, even more than Beaconer, is very firmly grounded here on planet Earth. He wants us to know what the life of a tenant farmer smells like, tastes like, feels like. I'm going to show you a couple of passages. So at one point he spent 70 pages describing the house of the Gudgers. That's the name they use for the family. They changed their name. Which has the odors of sweat in many stages of age and freshness. This sweat being a distillation of pork, lard, corn, wood smoke, pine, and ammonia. He talks about overalls. Try, I cannot write of it here, to imagine and to know their feeling against your body, realms of fine softness and marvel of a draping in velvet plays of light. And on their lack of an outhouse, they retire to the bushes, and they clean themselves as well as they can with newspaper if they have any around the house, otherwise with corn cobs, twigs, or leaves. This is very specific. Why is he getting so specific? He wants us to imagine ourselves into their bodies, because this is going to be crucial to the awakening of compassion that comes later. He wants us to imagine ourselves as this family. This brings me to number 3, suffering. James Agee's awakening, like King Lear's, takes place in conditions of physical discomfort, displacement, and suffering. Agee begins to write about the Gudger family as if he's looking into them and seeing God himself. At one point, he goes into a long meditation on what it is to be a human being, on each person containing both, quote, the tallest and most sanguine hope of Godhead, and a billionate choiring and drone of pain of generations upon generations unceasingly crucified. And this is the crux of Agee's awakening. God is walking around in a body, and it's the body of a nursing mother with 6 kids who's sewing their clothes out of flour sacks. For Agee, like Lear, this awakening happens in part because he shared that woman's physical discomfort. And the idea of shared suffering is so important to him that he actually uses Lear's soliloquy as the epigraph to his book, all the way from poor naked wretches straight through to shake the superflux to them and show the heavens more just. The thing is, once Agee starts to see this way, he can't stop. Not only that, he's nearly paralyzed with guilt. He sees himself as a cog in this economic system that is rigged against this family, and he hates himself for it. And this is where Agee trips over his feet, I think. Not because he's wrong about the economic system. He's right. It is rigged against them. but he tends to condemn himself and anyone else who's comfortable so completely that there's almost no hope for anybody. So for a while, the suffering just breeds more suffering. But then something else happens. In the middle of describing the makeshift beds that he and Evans are staying on, they've got sort of an orphaned back seat of a Chevy sedan and this pallet that's ridden with lice and bedbugs. A.G. goes into a long meditation on joy. He starts out by naming about 100 unpredictable things that have given him joy in his travels to Alabama. There's a huge list, and I'm just going to give you a snippet. The odor of scorched cloth, of a car's exhaust, of a girl, of pork, of beeswax on hot iron, the taste of turnip greens, of a rotted seed drawn from between the teeth, the swaying and shuffling beneath the body of a benighted train, the mold and brandy earth beneath the feet in fall. He goes on and on about these strange scattered moments where he experienced joy, and then he gives us a fascinating idea to chew on. He says that for him, coming from his comfortable world, and he's not talking about the Gudgers, I'll say more in a minute, he's just talking about him, the conditions needed to receive this kind of joy were precisely those of discomfort and displacement. Aside from sudden attacks, there are a few ways joy can give itself to you. Wandering alone, in sickness, on trains or buses, in the course of a bad hangover. In any rare situation which breaks down or lowers our habitual impatience, superficial vitality, over-eagerness to clinch conclusions, and laziness. This sounds like a residency. We were at this time, and in all the time surrounding it, in such a situation, nor could we have escaped it, even if we had wished to. Now this is very important. He is not saying that the conditions the Gudgers are living in are causing them joy. If you look at it in the context of the book, he actually sometimes will launch into rants exhorting the reader to wake up and do something about this and talk about the damage it does them. But for him, coming from his comfortable world, now that he's exposed himself to feel what tenant farmers feel, his defenses are falling apart. And the strange result of that is intermittent flashes of joy. I think what A.G. is getting at is that a life buffered from discomfort also buffers us from other things. That if we shut ourselves off from sharing other people's suffering, we're also shutting ourselves off from awakening and from this strange kind of intense joy that we can't experience in any other way. And that is the divine in disguise. In King Lear, love is usually in disguise. It's hidden in the plain silence of Cordelia, in the disguises of Kent and Edgar, and in the foolishness of the fool. And of course, when I say foolishness, I'm not talking about brainlessness. I mean the counterintuitive, the unexpected. The fool is no idiot. When Kent and Cordelia speak the truth out loud, they get banished. The fool's love is wilier. He says it in insult and song and riddle and jest, so he gets to stay. The holy in A.G.'s work is like the fool. It shows up in disguise and foolishness. And I've already mentioned that for A.G., the Gudgers were a divinity in disguise. And that's an idea that's common to many of the world's spiritual traditions, that God dwells in and among the oppressed and vulnerable, the exploited. But the smell of beeswax on hot iron causing an awakening of joy, that's just weird. That's what I mean by foolishness. Any God who would hide himself in the taste of a rotted seed drawn from between the teeth really may be a court jester. I like this idea of divine disguise better than the deus ex machina, that contrived plot device that leaps in at the last minute to save the day. Because if the writer's point is awakening, then maybe nobody's going to manage to save the day in the end. Maybe you're not going to have the traditional happy ending. That's not the point. The point is learning to see better. When the divine is in disguise, the reader may not recognize it until the end, or never recognize it. They're free. But the writer's not playing tricks. We're just being asked to look more carefully. Or, in the case of silence, to listen more carefully. Cordelia is the embodiment of love disguised as silence. She cannot heave her heart into her mouth, so her father banishes her. But even when she's banished, she continues to act for Lear's good. Frederick Buechner's God is a Cordelia kind of God, and he's often disguised in silence, which for Buechner is not the same thing as absence. And it's when Buechner dwells on this idea of silence, God's silence not being the same thing as God's absence, that the book becomes a religious experience for me. I mentioned earlier that these books are not perfect, and I want to show you one of those imperfect examples. At one point in the story, Godric is a young man, and he's sailing on a stolen ship from port to port, robbing and cheating people. And then his mother says, I want you to take me on a pilgrimage to Rome. So Godric does it. He finds the city a huge disappointment. And on their way home, a young woman named Gillian starts to appear to him. It's never really clear, is Gillian a figment of his imagination? Is she an angelic being? Is she another pilgrim? We don't know. But one day she shows up when he's drinking at a pond, and this is what she says. Your hull is thick with barnacles. There's mice that nibble at your shrouds. Rocks wait ahead the way you drift. Christ was a sailor too in Galilee. Hand him your helm. I prayed to him in Rome, I said. It was like calling down an empty well. Said Gillian, could it be it's he instead that's calling you? I said, but silence has no voice to call. The voice of silence calls, be still and hear, poor duds. She said, the empty well within your heart calls too. It says, be full. Now, what I'm about to say is a matter of taste, but personally, even as somebody who stumblingly does try to follow Christ in my life, I'm not moved when Gillian says, Christ was a sailor too in Galilee, hand him your helm. Like, it just feels like it's coming on too strong. But a few lines later, because Buechner's job as a writer is to help me experience this as Godric. Mystical experiences can't be described, they have to be experienced. And when she comes on that strong, I snap out of it. And a few lines later, I start to experience it, and it's when Godric talks about pain and emptiness. He says, it was like, I prayed to him in Rome, it was like calling down an empty well. Okay, now we're getting somewhere, because sometimes prayer does feel like calling down an empty well. And then when Gillian said, could it be it's he instead that's calling you? He says, but silence has no voice to call. That's a reasonable answer. He's voicing my doubts and my objections out loud. So now I'm a little freer to hear what Gillian has to say. And what she says is curious, and here, finally, Buechner makes a little room for me. She says, the voice of silence calls, be still and hear. It's like a riddle or a koan. It's an invitation to mystery. The voice of silence calls, be still and hear. Now, there are days that I even wish that he had left out that next line about the empty well calling and saying, be full. Because it's sort of, don't tell me what's in the silence. Just kind of invite me into silence and let me hear for myself. Eventually, of course, Godric will become a hermit. He's going to be intimately acquainted with silence. So here's what he has to say several decades in the future when he's an old man and he's been by himself for a long time. What's prayer? It's shooting shafts into the dark. What mark they strike, if any, who's to say? It's reaching for a hand you cannot touch. The silence is so fathomless that prayers like plummets vanish in the sea. You beg, you whimper, you load God down with empty praise. You tell him sins that he already knows full well. You seek to change his changeless will. Yet Godric prays the way he breathes. Else waves would dash him on the rocks, or he would drift with witless tides. And sometimes, by God's grace, a prayer is heard. Now, decades later, the silence is still there. It's not only there, it's fathomless. But something about Godric's perception has been awakened. He's hearing it differently. There's still loneliness in it, but there's also breath and life and grace. And this leads me to number 5, compassion. So now I'll plunge you all into suffering. You're welcome. And in the midst of it, maybe in a moment of silence when you're not hearing my 2-year-old wailing, you're having some kind of profound encounter. So what happens now? In Lear's case, he begins to ask, how shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness, defend you? For this Tom of Bedlam, he's worried that he's naked out in a hurricane. And more importantly to the plot, he begins to realize what he's done to his daughter, Cordelia. I think it's no coincidence that in the final scene when Cordelia dies, Lear mourns for her, he says, my poor fool is hanged. He calls her poor. He also conflates her with that other truth teller, the fool. Now, you could reasonably ask, what about all the other poor naked wretches that Lear's been ignoring all his life? Isn't it too late for them? As Shakespeare has it, yeah, it's too late. Lear's days of shaking a superflux are over. But what's the point? Well, one thing you can say is the value of Lear's awakening is not his to keep, but ours. And that's a valid answer. But there's another one. What does James Agee do in his awakening? He goes home, he writes a book. He wants people to see what he has seen. But even this feels inadequate to him. His friends are still down in Alabama getting paid below subsistence wages for picking cotton. And even the words that he can give them to describe them as full human beings, he feels are inadequate. What about Buechner's character, Godric? He gives away his stolen money, he spends his life praying and healing people, but even he asks, what's the use? For all three, the result of awakening is compassion. But what good is compassion if our response to it seems to be so inadequate? This is a question that's close to my heart as a writer, because writing itself can feel like a holy fool's errand. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who hears that voice when I sit down at my desk that says, what are you doing writing stories? Almost 1 billion people don't have clean water. You're trying to find the most beautiful way to say hurricane? What good are you? I've had a story on my mind recently that speaks to this. And it's from the Gospel of Mark, but I hope by this point it's clear that I share it not in the interest of proselytizing pat answers and platitudes, but rather as a story of two people with deep compassion for each other. It takes place the week before Jesus is going to die, and he's having dinner with his friends. And all of a sudden, this woman bursts in with this expensive alabaster jar of perfumed ointment, and she breaks it and she pours it over him. Now immediately all the men get up and they say, what are you doing? This perfume cost a year's wages. This could have been sold and given to the poor. And Jesus says, leave her alone. She did what she could. She did a beautiful thing to me. She anointed my body beforehand for burial. She did a beautiful thing to me. Who decides if our response to suffering is adequate? Maybe it's up to the suffering person. It's not that the men are wrong about sharing money with those who need it. From Jesus' teachings, this is obviously important to him too. But in this story, he's about to die. He is the suffering person. And here comes this woman doing this extravagantly wasteful thing. And what does he say? She did what she could. She did a beautiful thing to me. He specifically mentions beauty. He seems to be saying, I think, that sometimes when it comes from a place of deep compassion, beauty is the appropriate response to suffering. Now, I know that much of what I've said today just boils down to an argument for good storytelling and, it's better to go on the holy fool's errand than not to go. So, you use musical language to usher your reader into a world, create that physical, touchable, sensory world for them to live in, allow the character to suffer. Don't gloss over the suffering. Don't put a deus ex machina in your story, but maybe put a deus right next to them or within them in disguise. But the most important thing that I often forget when I'm working with words, because I love words, I love the way they sound, I love the way it feels to put them together, is compassion. I forget to come in close to my characters. I'm having so much fun setting off verbal bottle rockets that I keep them at arm's length. Or even worse, I don't forget, I just shy away from it because I don't want to expose myself to more suffering, or I don't want to expose myself to you, the reader. But this place of shared suffering is where awakening happens. Expose thyself to feel what wretches feel, that thou mayst shake the superflux to them and show the heavens more just. What is superflux? The literal translation is overflow. It's a pouring out. So break your jar, and you pour out your offering, and for the sake of love and all that is holy, you risk looking like a fool. Thank you. In here, pray undo this button. All right, have at it. Yes, Nicola.
I think I speak for all of us when I say that was a work of art. I guess I just have a question. You know, when we crack open our heart on the page, the risk is embarrassing the reader. And I think you've probably answered my question really anyway in your lecture. But I'm just interested in how do you, what thoughts do you have about that? What kind of experiences have you had of struggling with that?
Embarrassing the reader in what way? No, kind of help me answer the question.
By exposing the divine, if you like, in the human. Sometimes when we write, I know sometimes when I'm writing or when people are reading literature that's trying to get at that.
Gosh.
Sorry, I'm
No, not at all. No, I think it's a good question.
The superflux, the overflow is embarrassment. The result can be embarrassment.
For the reader or for the writer?
For the reader, particularly for the modern reader.
Well,
that we're not used to reading like that anymore.
right. Well, the first thing that springs to my mind right away is distance. I mean, yes, you're pouring out the superflux, but you're doing it with your left brain engaged, you know, so you pour it out and then you find a way that it's not just bleh for the reader. I don't know, I think it's a question you have to maybe address word to work. I don't think it would be a bad thing if more contemporary fiction had more of this in it. I really do. I get frustrated because I want to read books. And sometimes I find that Alison Edison turned me into a bunch of good writers. William Trevor was like, you know, when I read Chekhov, that was great, and I asked her, are there any contemporary writers talking about the big life questions? So, I don't know, I'm not sure there's one answer, but I think it's a question, it's absolutely a question to think about. Amanda?
Thanks for that, Jen. I'm just curious, you know, which writers you would have used if you had set out to bring 3 women writers in front of us to accomplish this.
3 women. Well, Kathleen Norris springs to mind immediately. Alice also turned me onto a wonderful book called Tell Me Another Morning by Zadina Berger. Let me write that on the board because it's so good you have to. So, Berger's work is an autobiographical novel of her time in concentration camps during the Holocaust, and she lost her family. And hers would be a true, I mean, the works that I talked about today kind of were both religious and religion works. They had some of religion themes. Berger's doesn't really. She mentions a few times, you know, where's God in all this, which is, you know, the ultimate question that the Holocaust brings up. And, you know, at one point her mother says to her, we prayed all our lives. Or, no, her mother says, you know, please pray. And Berger, where the character thinks, what good does it do? We prayed all our lives. But when I read this book, it raised questions in me about God's presence or his role as, you know, sanctuary or protector in a way that gave me new and less pat answers. So I don't know what she intended, but I know that it acted on me in wonderful ways. And a 3rd woman writer. I don't know, let me tell you later about that one. Rather than make you all sit and watch me think. Oh, Jimmy.
Thank you, Jen. That was really good.
Thank you.
So it's interesting because you talked about a non-fiction book and a novel, and just now you spoke of an autobiographical novel. And just in talking about like writing about suffering, like does that process have to be different for the writer of non-fiction than fiction? Because the non-fiction writer is talking about real people. I'm just wondering if you could talk about that. Because I know you've written both fiction and non-fiction.
Yeah, I don't know about the nonfiction writer in general, but for me, when I did my switch, the challenge when I'm writing fiction is always to imagine myself closer to the character, to put myself there and think, all right, what were they feeling? And that's how I can get into the suffering. For nonfiction, I kind of had to be convinced by Sven, I guess, also to do the same thing. Because I was writing myself as a character and had this distance from it. I didn't want to go into it. I'm just going to bounce along and make nice phrases. And, so then make me slow down and go very slow and deep into every inch of suffering. No, he was very kind and helpful about it, actually. But it could be, if you're someone like me, it could be a similar process. Or for another nonfiction writer who that easily pours out of, it might be a question of creating some distance. I saw Ed had his hand up before.
Thank you, Jennifer. This question of the divine in disguise, I'm more and more enthralled by the mystical writers and what they're exactly doing, because by definition they're writing about something that can't be expressed.
Okay.
But still they produce huge literatures, and it's true in Christianity and in Zen too. The Zen say that you can't express this, but then they have volume after volume. Zen writings, right?
Yeah.
So what's going on? And I'm curious about your take. How do you relate their project to the writer's project? Is there a sense where the writer, we're all kind of doing the same thing, where it's a mystical striving to express something that can never fully be captured?
Yeah. Well, this Agee is a perfect example of that, because he spends 400 pages going, I can't speak of it, I don't have the words. I mean, he constantly is going back to like, I don't know what to say. And then he pours out, 70 pages about what a house looks like, because he's trying and trying. And I go back and forth about whether he could have used an editor like a David Gates of his own. Because if David Gates read that book, he'd be like, what? Or he probably has read it already. And he probably didn't say what, because he just goes on, and it could stand some cutting. Although there's other times when I read it, and I think the music of all that language and him trying to get at it points at something bigger in a way that Concision perhaps couldn't. And it acts on me in the way that music does, and that my mind begins to roam and I have insights. Did that answer your question? It's kind of, sort of.
Point.
What?
You're pointing.
I'm pointing?
I mean, it's a pointing effort.
Oh. What was the second part of the question?
How are we involved in the same kind of project?
Oh, yeah. Sure. That's good. Okay. Oh, okay. I'll do that later. Thank you. That was your break.